Over the course of the next couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks, I'd like to just take some time during the sermon and talk a little bit about a biblical understanding of culture. Culture meaning attitudes or beliefs or values and norms of the society that is around us, and how we are to view that society as believers or Bible believers. Culture at its essence is, it means to cultivate something, to foster something to grow or to improve upon by labor or care. So when you apply that to our culture, you start to ask questions as Christians. What culture are we as people supposed to produce? What are we supposed to cultivate? Is there a right culture? Is there a wrong culture? Is there a right way of doing things? A wrong way? Are all cultures equal? As Christians, we're supposed to communicate the gospel into the culture. Are we supposed to communicate it as not to offend culture? Or are we to communicate the gospel as to shape culture or to cultivate it to grow in a certain way? And I think these are important questions, of course, considering the times that we are living in, considering that we don't really have to look far to see that our culture around us is growing more and more secular and in many ways more and more hostile to Christianity by the day. These are also important questions because it's what we're supposed to do as believers in Jesus Christ. We want to win the world or the cultures of the world for Christ. It's our biblical mandate, right? To go and make disciples of every nation meaning every culture. So we have to especially win our culture first, right? And I'd like to talk about this for a couple weeks because I think that many times our churches would rather not do these things. Many times we would rather just kind of avoid the conflict that is created. And because the truth is when we bring God's truth to our culture, there is conflict that's created. Because if we are bringing God, then we are claiming a truth statement, right? And any type of truth, any claim of truth, saying that Scripture and the gospel is truth, then we are claiming that there is a right way and a wrong way to live. And that will lead to conflict, and that always leads to disagreements. And so instead, many times we as churches or we as pastors, we use our theology or we use maybe our witness to try to conform it to culture so that we're not seen as judgmental or we're not seen as not being nice in any way. But many times when we do this, it can be easy for us to take the gospel and twist it or maybe play, use verbal gymnastics in some sort of way in order to fit the gospel into the culture around us so that we are to avoid conflict. Because as Christians, we always like to abide by that 11th commandment. Do you all know what the 11th commandment is? It's thou shalt always be nice to everyone, right? That's the 11th commandment. But the truth is, if our goal is to win the world or the cultures for Christ, we have to be prepared from time to time to come into conflict with the culture around us. The church needs to cultivate something. It needs to cultivate a culture of truth first. Niceties come after. I found myself abiding by the 11th commandment many times early on in my ministry career. I never wanted to offend anybody as a pastor. I never wanted to seem judgmental in any way, wanting to always be nice to everyone. And I hate to admit it, if I'm truly honest with myself, there were times when I could take my education from seminary without even being aware of it And I could take a piece of Scripture and I could apply that sort of theological gymnastics to the piece of Scripture, and I could work it, and I could, in some way, make it fit to the culture, or at least place doubt in its truth. And in the process, it could gut it of its importance. I could ignore all swaths of Scripture because they just weren't nice Scriptures, right? And the result was that I found that I began to lose coherency with the biblical narrative from Genesis through Revelation. It didn't all fit together nice and neat anymore. It lacked a coherent understanding. The Scriptures seemed scattered and they didn't fit together. But the result was that everyone was happy because no one was offended, no one was judged in any way, and everyone had God's approval. Salvation was given to everyone, and living life with God was nothing but love and grace and peace. It was nice, right? And I wasn't the only one. There's many pastors who specialize in the 11th commandment way of doing ministry and teaching and preaching, and I have come to believe that it's a flawed theology. And I think in many ways we've been reaping what we've sowed in our culture today. The title of this sermon series is Rest Under the Shade of the Tree, but Biblical Truth to a Broken Culture. And I say broken culture in the title of the sermon series because I truly believe that we're living in a culture that in many ways is broken. I believe it's a culture that's broken because it has lost any semblance of the idea of truth. And I remember the moment that I really became aware that this culture was more broken than I had previously thought. It was during one of the BLM riots, and there was this reporter standing in front of a building that was on fire, and there was cars burning and things like that behind him, and it was just this scene of destruction behind him. And he was trying to convince you that the riots were not riots, but merely protests that were mostly peaceful. There's the peace right there. Except for, of course, the small majority that were burning everything to the ground and looting everything. A culture, a cultivation that can lie and twist and use semantic word games, verbal gymnastics to get you to support an ideology or belief that is far from God. That is what I mean by a broken culture. And it was around that time that I realized that maybe us 11th Commandment pastors maybe had contributed to some of this over the years. Seeing the brokenness in the culture, it led me to dive back into the Scriptures in a new way. Searching for coherency once again and real truth in the Scriptures, turning towards the narrative without worrying about any of the niceties of them. And just allowing the Scripture to point me to God and point me to all of His truth, as much as my fallen nature could allow, in order to begin to cultivate godly truth in my life and in my ministry. Truth first, niceties second, because the truth of the matter is there's no such thing as the 11th commandment, right? There's just 10. But the good news is when you go back to Scripture, you find out quickly that there are people like you, that there are human beings like you, that there's cultures like you. This isn't the first time that we've had a broken culture. In many ways, maybe we've been a broken culture from the very beginning of history. We have examples of cultures and peoples of the past who we can look to help with what we are to do in order to heal some of the brokenness that we find ourselves in today. For example, we were a broken culture during the era of slavery in this country. Part of our culture said that owning other people was okay. And we clawed our way back from that. And how did we do that? We did that through the abolitionist movement, right? First through abolitionist Christians in England, like William Wilberforce, and then through the same Christian beliefs that moved in the abolitionist movement in this country. Some right here in New Brighton, as the plaques around the town bear witness to the Underground Railroad. Of course, this culminated in a war that wasn't very nice, right? ending hundreds of thousands of lives. But in many ways, that time, maybe the Civil War in itself, was a broken society searching for, turning towards, and standing up for, to the point of death, standing up for godly truth. And that led us out of the struggles of those days. Sometimes we need to cultivate a culture of truth first, period, regardless of how nice it seems. And it isn't just for our culture, it isn't just for our time or in modern times. This goes back, broken cultures are almost a part of the entire biblical narrative, time and time again. Over and over, the story of the Old Testament is a story of a culture that is broken, in search of reasons for its brokenness. And one of those times is from our reading this morning from 2 Kings and the story about King Josiah of Judah. A little background: at the time of King Josiah, Israel had once been a united kingdom under King David, 400 years previous to King Josiah. But because of rebellion and sin in the culture, the kingdom became divided. There was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was known as Israel, or remained known as Israel, and the southern kingdom became known as Judah in the south, with Jerusalem as their capital. So already, long before King Josiah became king of Judah, you have a people, you have a nation, you have a culture that is broken in two. And then things just get worse from there. 80 years before Josiah, the Assyrians come and they completely wipe out the northern kingdom of Israel and exile all the people to Mesopotamia. So the entire northern kingdom is gone. But in the south, the kingdom of Judah just barely hanging on, the culture begins to fall apart piece by piece. Josiah's grandfather, Manasseh, King Manasseh, who is written about in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, instituted a polytheist worship style. That's basically worship of many gods in the culture. Manasseh established local shrines to worship the god of Baal and the Assyrian god Asherah. Even in the temple, this was going on. So zealous was he for worshiping pagan gods, he is said to have participated in 2 Kings in the sacrificial cult of Moloch. Do you know what that is? That is a god that you sacrifice your children to by fire. Judah's culture was inundated with a medley of native and foreign cults at this time, so much so that God, through the prophet, God's words through the prophet spoke to him in Jeremiah, promising that he would destroy Judah for the things that Manasseh had done. But Manasseh didn't listen to the prophets either. Actually, it's believed that prophets like Isaiah and Habakkuk were persecuted and killed by him. Tradition says that Isaiah, Manasseh's own grandfather, suffered a particularly painful execution at his hands. And for many decades, those who sympathized with these prophets, they were in constant danger and threat. And then things got even worse. Amon was the son of Manasseh. And following Manasseh's death, Amon began his reign of Judah at the age of 22, and this reign lasted only 2 years because he was so bad that his own people killed him. He was so awful that he only reigned for 2 years. The Bible records that Amon continued his father Manasseh's practice of idolatry and set up pagan images. 2 Kings states that Amon did that which was evil in the sight of Yahweh. And he walked in all the ways that his father walked, and he served the idols that his father served and worshiped them. There are accounts that Amon even set fire to the Torah. Do you understand that? He set fire to all the ancient scrolls of Moses, and that he allowed spider webs to cover the altar in the temple for lack of use. Just complete and total turning their back from God. Amon sinned a lot, Scripture says. And when he died, it was like good riddance. Good riddance to the nation of Judah. And into this broken culture comes his son, Josiah. He was 8 years old when he became king. And 2 Kings and Chronicles says that in the 8th year of his reign, this 16-year-old boy. He looks around at his broken culture, once great united kingdom under King David, divided and conquered by foreign enemies, morally abhorrent, a temple in ruins, scrolls of the great God of David in burnt and tatters, gods of Baal and Asherah and Moloch poisoning the thoughts of the people and destroying their children, threatening their livelihood, their stability, their culture was completely in shambles, completely broken. They were the last vestige of a promised people in a promised land. It was not nice there. Nothing was nice. And King Josiah begins to ask himself, how did this happen? What went wrong? And so he begins to go back to the basics. And he tries to seek the God of David, Scripture says. And in the process, he begins to slowly have the temple restored. And then during its restoration, a room is being cleared out. And an old scroll has survived the burning. The burning that happened during Amon's reign. And the scroll is brought to Josiah. Scripture says it was the book of the law, that it was Deuteronomy. Some scholars believe that it was only a portion of Deuteronomy because it was probably burned. Pieces of work that were written by Moses 1,000 years before to tell the people of God that God promised them a land, and that if they would trust and obey his covenant with them, then he is the only God, and that they would be a blessed people through him. But also it says that he is a jealous God, that he's angered by sin, but also faithful, loving, and merciful all at the same time. And Israel was called to obey him and only him, to fear him, to love him, to serve him through obedience to his truth and the pursuit of personal holiness as laid out in this book. Because of who God is, it says, God's people are holy. They will be the foundation for the cultivation of a culture for the people of the promised land, for the people of the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and King David. The one true God is holy, and those who believe in him and obey him will be holy too. And then Scripture says that Josiah began to weep when he heard it, because he knew instantly where they had gone wrong. They didn't believe, and they didn't obey. Glory be to the Lord our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, and King David, and thank God, King Josiah. We'll continue next week.